Hello, my friends, and thank you again for joining us here on Patreon. This is part two of our reading of The Demonologist, and today we're going to be talking about the different things that were in the first part that I read to you. Now, in the copy of the book that I'm using, which I love because it's here, I'm going to read the inscription to you. To Mike, love great-grandma Warren. Mike's my son. And this was at about the time when my gram was having trouble writing because her arthritis was so bad. So it's nice to have this copy. And when my son wants it, I will definitely give it to him. But in the very first page, it says, Academy Award nominated actress Vera Farmiga on how she prepared for the role of Lorraine Warren in the blockbuster film The Conjuring. Primarily, my research relied heavily on the nonfiction book The Demonologist. Despite its popularity, I found the book was hard to acquire. Now, the truth is that has been a real problem for so many people over the years, and I'm glad it's out again now. But I know so many of my acquaintances who have bought it and shared it again and again and again, because this book is almost like a textbook. Almost. Anyway, it is unlike any book I have ever read, Vera said. It's a book about mystical theology. In it, one learns just how and why mystical phenomena occur. It scared the daylights out of me, profoundly. The preface insists that it is not dangerous to read and that knowledge is power. Whatever. I felt a sense of terror every time I cracked it open. I never read the book in the sanctity of my home. I could only read it in flight, funnily enough. Somehow, I felt safeguarded in an airplane. Vera Farmiga. Well, I hate to spoil her her perception there, but she would not have been safeguarded in an airplane. There is no danger to reading The Demonologist, and knowledge is definitely power. It's ignorance that causes so much pain in this world, especially with the paranormal. So just something to keep in mind. Now, it says in the author's preface that all the incidents took place during the middle or late 1970s. That means that this was before a lot of the amazing cases that my grandparents were famous for. And they were just really becoming well known over the last 3 or 4 years before this book had been written. Now, there had been another book before this called Deliver Us from Evil. And you will find it on Amazon. Some woman has somehow stolen the rights, or I guess nobody cares, and she's self-publishing it. But I have to admit, it's the book that terrified me. Anyway, here it also says that nevertheless, the reader should be reminded that only infrequently do outside forces directly or forcefully interfere in people's lives. It is irresponsible to assign blame to unnatural forces when the real fault all too often lies within ourselves. And this is a point that I really wanted to stress because it is unusual, the paranormal. And we shouldn't be looking to demons and ghosts and spirits to blame our problems. Almost always, it's us or other people that are causing the problems. So always look for the natural before you go to the supernatural. To move on, into the foreword. And by the way, to refresh your memory, the foreword was written by Reverend John C. Hughes. And he was a friend of my grandparents. And he describes them right away as really pleasant people, deeply concerned for the hurts and wounds of others, whether psychic or spiritual. And I have to say, that is very much my grandparents. More my grandmother than my grandfather. I think my grandfather actually, he liked the hunt. You know, he liked to help, but he also liked the thrill. My grandmother, on the other hand, was much more motherly and much more interested in the people. And she would drop things in the middle of the night to talk to people who were in fear. And they both were very, very good at communicating. One of the things that I continue in the foundation is the fact that we don't worry about race or religion or ethnic background or anything like that. We will help anyone, and so did my grandparents. They weren't locked into a religion. My grandmother was certainly devout, and incredibly compassionate. My grandfather, the only times I ever saw that man go into a church was if we were in England or Scotland or working on a case. He was not he never went to midnight mass on Christmas Eve with Graham and I. It just wasn't who he was. It wasn't how he did things. He was a man from World War II and very much a man's man. I get a kick out of the fact that when this was written, they had 35 years of experience working on this. And now I've got coming on 41 years in August. And they say that in the forward it says that everything was carefully recorded with scientific precision and analysis. I will tell you, my grandparents were not very good at collecting data. And they were not very good at keeping files. God knows I wish they were. And it's something we're working to change. It also says here that the Warrens' personal gifts of psychic and spiritual discernment and devout prayer lead them to frequent consultation with clergy for the ministry of the church and its power of good over the forces of evil. Well, my grandmother was psychic, and according to her, the only psychic power my grandfather ever had was he could always tell when there was a snake in the garden. Now, to me, that seems like hyperbole. I mean, there's always a snake in the garden. And it says also that the Reverend Hughes says that he was especially touched by the sincerity, humility, and prudence that this couple communicate, and the spirit of congeniality that seems to travel with them. I agree with that completely. Well, all right, not completely. They were not the humblest people in the world. They enjoyed the attention. They enjoyed what happened to them later in life, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, when they were finally being given the respect they certainly deserved. It also says here, to the person who believes in the God of the Bible, demonic worship is an evil, paganistic practice that chooses to oppose God. I don't understand why they say paganistic here. Pagan religions are not satanic, and they're not demonic. And it's that prejudice and that ignorance that annoys me, because we don't want to paint all faiths as evil. There are many paths to God. Anyway, it also says here that demonic worship is truly dangerous, and of course it is. And that's something that you should be very careful. Anytime you are focusing on negative, that's a problem. That's what you will attract. You will not attract positivity by reaching out to something negative. The next thing that they go into here is the Oxford English Dictionary definition of a spirit. And what I found interesting is I don't agree with it completely. It says that a spirit can become visible at pleasure. It's frequently conceived as troublesome, terrifying, or hostile to mankind. It cannot become visible at pleasure. That's the thing. Yes, they are frequently perceived to be troublesome, terrifying, or hostile to mankind. But in reality, almost all of them are harmless. Almost all of them are simply us, just people. And why would we ever be afraid of them? Now, in chapter 1, Beyond Amityville, it just kind of struck me that my grandfather was actually younger than I was when he was in Amityville. And when George and Kathy Lutz bought the house, and they moved in just before Christmas, they knew that the place had been the scene of a horrible murder, but they really weren't worried about it at the time. What is chilling to me and to my grandparents is that on November 13th, 1974, at around 3:15 in the morning, Ron DeFeo murdered his family, and at exactly the same moment, and yes, I will say this is probably coincidence, but at exactly the same moment, Ed Warren's mother, my great-grandmother, died. You know, another thing that I found interesting, Christopher Lutz, who's their son, well, actually, he's Kathy's son. He is not a fan of George, who was his stepfather. He contacted me when I was in the jungle here in Colombia, and I called him and I talked to him for a while. He is a terribly damaged man who has been carrying the weight of Amityville all these years, and it did follow him, and it did cause him problems. And he didn't know who I was exactly. He contacted me because he thought I was working on some kind of Amityville movie, and he was trying to threaten me to not do that. With a number of incredibly bad Amityville movies that are out there, Amityville Shark, Amityville Exorcist, Amityville Zombie Shark, I mean, ridiculous, Amityville Island. I don't blame the poor guy. And also it says here that by the end of January 1976, they had worked on over 3,000 paranormal and supernatural disturbances, my grandparents. And I can honestly say that was probably closer to 10,000. I've worked on more than 10,000. It also, in the next line, says, the question the news media had essentially wanted answered was whether or not there was a ghost in the house at the time in Amityville. Now, I want to make clear here that this was Channel 5 News that had contacted my grandparents. And they were actually investigating this thing. Then on page 3, it says that there are two types of spirits that are encountered in true haunting situations. One is human, the other, however, is inhuman. And an inhuman spirit is something that has never walked the earth in human form. Sort of true. There are ghosts who are not human. My dog was a ghost. Cats, dogs come back. Anything that is loved, that creates an attachment to us, can come back and manifest to us. I've heard of others talking about other kinds of animal manifestations, but honestly, it's unclear whether those are animals or something else, like in inhuman spirit. Now, inhuman spirits can come in a whole lot of different guises. My grandparents generally came across as trying to say that inhuman spirits were demons or angels. But in reality, they also believed in elementals, they believed in fairies, they believed in a whole bunch of different manifestations. So to break it down as only two is kind of hard for me. It also says that my grandfather's office is located in a small cottage-sized building attached to the main house by a long enclosed passageway. It's actually an old art studio. That's what it originally was. My grandparents were artists. And when my grandfather got out of World War II, he actually used his GI Bill to go to art school. I don't know that that was the best plan for most people, as a way of getting ahead, but it certainly worked out for him. The next thing that they had talked about, and I wanted to touch base on, is how at 3:15 that old, big, almost dungeon-like door opened at the other end of the corridor that led to the house. And my grandfather heard 3 steps walking down the hall, just like it was 3:15 in the morning at this time. And also when the murders took place. My grandfather's theory was that 3 a.m. was the devil's hour, and 3:15 was the precise moment when Jesus died on the cross. And therefore 3:15 in the morning is seen as a repudiation or blasphemy against Christ. I don't know that I agree with that. Big surprise, right? But I think that because I've seen how our beliefs control manifestations around the world, I do believe that it is the fact that we believe that three is important is the reason that it does manifest that way. They also, the author also says that there was a rank and pungent smell of sulfur that rose in the room just before this black whirlwind swirled in. And that scent, that smell of rotten eggs or rotten meat, is incredibly common in these cases. It's something that we have a visceral reaction to. So it is extremely powerful when it hits us. Now, if these entities are intelligent, then that makes sense because they are using what we fear against us, the things that get them the most energy. My question, though, is, could it also be that it's our fear that creates those manifestations of the things that will terrify us the most? You know, when people watch these paranormal programs on television, they start to manifest those things when they have their own problems. It's one of the things we tell people when they report that they're having problems at home. You know, we say, look, are you watching these paranormal programs? Please stop. Don't watch them anymore. And I want you to start raising the vibrations of your home by, playing comedies and happy music and things that'll make you dance and, make love and play games together. That's how you overcome or start to overcome these negative things that are affecting you. Then there was something else that was really important. And this is a story that we don't tell very often. But when my grandfather was being confronted by this black mass, it says that it slowly began to back off, though not before giving Ed a clear vision of himself and Lorraine involved in a potentially deadly automobile accident along a highway. With that, the entity withdrew into the passageway from whence it came. Well, my grandparents were driving through Pennsylvania after Amityville, and they had just been through Bethlehem and Paradise and the Lord's Valley and all of these biblical sounding names. And my grandfather made an offhanded joke. He said, not even Amityville or Annabelle could hurt us here. And as soon as he said that, and this was on Route 84 in eastern Pennsylvania, and about a half mile behind, there was a truck, and otherwise the highway was empty. And as he said that, something slammed into the back of their car, made it spin around and go into a ditch between the highways, the two roads. The truck stopped, and he swore it was as though something had slammed into them from behind and spun them around. The next thing was when this thing went through the main corridor to my grandmother. My grandfather avoided the passageway, flung open the side door, and ran up the back steps of the house. The reason he did that is you do not want to be stuck in an enclosed space that small with that kind of evil energy, that kind of negative energy. My grandmother was upstairs reading the biography of Padre Pio. This is incredibly important because Padre Pio is the patron of our family. He has been on the Haunted case, the Schmurl case in West Pittston, Pennsylvania with me. He was in Amityville, and there's an incredibly famous photo of Padre Pio looking down at my grandmother. And it also says he is destined for sainthood. Well, he actually is a saint. So this book, it's old. It's about 45 years old. The next passage I wanted to bring your attention to was the manifestation of a comparatively rare phenomenon known as an inhuman demonic spirit, a preternatural entity. The inhuman spirit is considered to be possessed of a negative, diabolical intelligence fixed in a perpetual rage against both man and God. Now, there's a lot there to unpack that I disagree with. A lot. For instance, my grandfather always said that one of the reasons demons hated us is because we have free will. But to me, if a demon doesn't have free will, then how does it choose to attack us? How does it choose to hate us? So that I have a problem with. The word preternatural, of course, always refers to negative paranormal activity. It was a word that my grandparents used often. They hardly ever used the word paranormal. It's always supernatural or preternatural. The other thing is it says diabolical intelligence. Honestly, if these things were that smart, they would change their patterns. They would try new things. And as far as I can see, it's always the same manifestations over and over and over again, depending on the cultural and religious beliefs of the people. So keep that in mind as well. And it then goes on to say that understanding these spirits and what they can do and what its existence ultimately portends, that's the work and concern of the demonologist. We'll be addressing this in the next chapter, so I won't get into it too much, but I'm not a fan of the idea of demonology. Of course, we should study this phenomena, but if you only do it from one religion, then all you're doing is a theological study. You're not actually studying. So it's something to keep in mind. I love the fact that in this first chapter, they also talk about the ghost of a 19th century manservant who became active in a mansion at West Point and began harassing guests. Now, this story fascinated me when I first read it, and I read this in Deliver Us from Evil, their first book. And the fact that the U.S. military called my grandparents in to look at this, that just blows my mind. I mean, 1972, it was a different world back then, I guess. Just unbelievable. And then he goes on, my grandfather goes on to say that the cause of the disturbances in both cases he was talking about, where things were going really bad and there was a lot of poltergeist activity, he says was demonic. My grandfather tended to see the demonic in a lot of places where I wouldn't. He was shaped by his time and his beliefs, and that's fine. But I'm always uncomfortable sharing this. It's only in Patreon that I guess I feel completely okay with it. But I just don't think they're nearly as common as my grandfather always seemed to see. And when they are there, I don't think that they're what he thought they were. His views changed over time, and that's great. He understood that this was a field of study. It then goes on to say, who are these two people seen in the background of news photographs but hardly ever identified? Being my grandparents. By 1972, there was a famous case in Bridgeport on Lindley Street, and it caused a stir all over the country. And by that point, my grandparents were definitely known. And it's interesting to me because as far as I know, they never shied away from publicity. They always were out there. It's true that they were not occultists or eccentrics. They were actually so middle class. They loved their animals, and they were playing with them all the time, and they loved to socialize, and they weren't into weird ideas or weird fun. They were just good, honest, positive people. And, really, that's the point that's made here. That the Warrens are effective in their work only because they are such positive people. If you're negative, if you are somebody suffering, then you should not be working in this field. If you're not bringing positive energy into a case, then you may be bringing something really harmful. So keep that in mind if you are an investigator listening to this. I also love the way that Gerald Brittle describes my grandfather more like the corner grocer than a demonologist. Now, that was when he was about 50 years old, and oh, absolutely, he looked like the corner butcher. Um, he definitely was unpretentious looking. Um, I certainly would not agree with Gerald that he was calm and easygoing. My grandfather was a type A personality who could quickly scream, yell, lose his patience very, very quickly. And my grandmother was extraordinary. She could ignore him. She would say, "Yes, dear," and then just continue with whatever she was doing. If we're going to talk about calm and easygoing, that would be my grandmother. I also love that they describe her, Gerald Brittle describes her appearance as that of a fashionable New England housewife. Um, Always fashionable. Um, always impeccably dressed, even when you showed up at the house unannounced. She just never wore pants, always dressed to the nines. But also the one that took care of the house and took care of the grounds and took care of everything. I mean, she just, she was unpretentious. Now, it talks about her being a light trance medium. I thought this was something we could talk about for a moment. A light trance medium, and I happen to be one as well. When you're working, you can transmit information and you have greater perception, but you do not remember much of it when you're done. It's also important to remember that this is a biblical gift of discernment of spirits, and it shouldn't be demonized. It's a gift from God. My grandmother saw it that way. I sort of see it that way. I mean, I kind of wish I didn't have it, but I'm using it because I'm supposed to. And that question of what really happened in the Amityville case that they used to get all the time, and we, still have people who ask, oh, could there be a more divisive case in the paranormal world than the Amityville horror? We recently posted that famous photo of that little boy in the Amityville house with the shining eyes looking out from the bedroom door. People have often said that my grandparents brought me into the house at 13 years old or so to pose for that photo. Well, that's bull crap. At 13, I was terrified of my own shadow, let alone going into a haunted house. And not only that, my grandparents wouldn't have done that to me. And I sure that doesn't look like a 13-year-old to anybody, does it? But also, and this is important, this picture was not taken by my grandparents. It was taken by the Channel 5 news photographer. So, he didn't even know what he was taking a picture of. He just snapped a shot. He was as shocked as anybody when he saw that. Another story that goes around is that Jay Anson and the Lutzes and their lawyer sat down over several bottles of wine and concocted this story so that they could become rich. Well, that's bullcrap. Actually, the lawyer put out that story when he tried to grab more rights and more money from the books, and it turns out maybe Jay Anson got some money, but the Lutzes never saw a penny from any of this. Nothing. Not from any of these stories that have, made their families' lives so difficult. Jay Anson also correctly points out that when they're doing lectures, my grandmother's often wearing a long tartan skirt. My grandfather's wearing a matching tartan tie. They loved Scotland, loved it. They went back to Great Britain every single year. They would bring a small tour with them. It's something I would love to do for people again because I'd love to recreate that. I did it with them. I loved it. And it's like 3,500 miles from the top of Britain, from the top of Scotland in John O'Groats to the Isle of Skye, down to the tip of Land's End in Cornwall, out all the way to the cliffs of Dover. Just an extraordinary experience. And hopefully we'll get to do that in the future. We'll see what happens. As the author goes on to talk about the lecture, they describe the very first slide that comes up, and I remember this slide so well. It's a picture of this little old lady. She's in a London flat, and she's looking out the window at the family. And it turns out that that woman was the child's grandmother and had passed away. This is why I have such a hard time with the globes and the orbs and that kind of thing. The photos and evidence I'm used to look like people, so it's kind of hard for me to accept the rods and stuff. That's digital flares and so forth. It also quotes my grandfather saying, the existence of spirits is not a matter of belief, it's a matter of evidence. In fact, the question is not so much a matter of whether the phenomena is there, but why is it there? And why is it so incredibly meddlesome in human affairs? Now, this is something I absolutely agree with. I don't really care about whether or not these things are explainable or anything. I'm trying to understand why it's happening to this family. Because if we don't understand the why, then we're not going to get to the underlying problem and actually be able to help those people. One of the things, because we are talking about lectures, I got to tell you my own personal memories of this. I loved their lectures. I mean, they came to my high school. They came to my middle school, as a matter of fact, and did lectures, for us, because they loved me. And it was amazing listening to people and how excited they were, and everybody had stories. And after their 1.5-hour lecture, they'd do 2 hours of questions, because all of us in my family agree that our purpose here is to answer or to educate people. Education is power, and it will protect you. If you do not know what you're dealing with, you're going to be afraid, and those fears can make your life much, much worse, your case much, much worse. So we always try to alleviate those fears through education and helping people understand that those footsteps in the hall are probably not Satan. It's probably your grandmother. There's a question here about whether or not spirits can cross over water. And my grandfather rightly points out that spirits are not affected by physical boundaries. That's just an old superstition. And that distance doesn't matter. They are not part of this world, these entities. They're energy. They're not limited. They can be there instantaneously. Time and space are meaningless to them. And that's something that if you don't accept that, then you're putting limits on them that don't really exist. And that can get you in a lot of danger as well. The chapter then goes on to talk about how Channel 5 had asked my grandparents to do a seance for the cameras. And my grandparents did it with 2 other mediums. Now, this was, when they were just starting to become well-known. I really have a hard time believing that they did it, but I know they did. They told me they did it. And how they did it at night. I can't imagine a more seriously dangerous thing for them to do. And they did it with 17 people present. My grandfather said that he suffered from heart flutterings and palpitations, and that half of the people during the seance experienced or reported phenomena in the house that they considered to be out of the ordinary. Now, I have a problem with that. That's kind of the halo effect, where people get afraid and start ascribing supernatural causes to things that are perfectly normal, or they start getting afraid and their fear makes them feel things. So, for me, I take that with a grain of salt. They do say that the seance was a fiasco, but they blame it on these entities, and I'm not so sure I would agree with that. There was a question in the audience as to how we know whether or not these demonic spirits we're talking about aren't really something human, just mean ghosts. And my grandmother said that both spirits and demons can be extremely malicious. Sometimes they even work together. Now, I will tell you that my grandmother later in life said that she had never seen a time when a demon and a ghost were working together, because ghosts are always pushed aside by these entities. Now, I have worked cases where researchers have claimed that both are there, and that the demon perhaps is imprisoning spirits, human spirits. That's another thing I take with a grain of salt. I don't know that I've ever seen any evidence of that. But my grandmother goes on to say that only the demonic, however, has the power to bring about such incredible negative phenomena as fires, explosions, dematerialization, teleportation, and levitation of large objects. The important part of that is of large objects, because human spirits can do most of that as well on a small scale. It's the scale that matters. When it's over the top huge, it's usually not human. We've worked on cases where human spirits are so focused and so angry that they can move things like tables and throw plates around and things like that. But refrigerators and televisions, not so much. The other thing that I found interesting is how my grandmother says that wherever they went, people had been reading The Exorcist. About a year later, after this was written, we were in Ohio, and one of the three exorcists from the true case that the movie and the book were based on was at that lecture and had come specifically to meet my grandparents. So that was an extraordinary experience. And I still say, and I hate exorcism movies, but The Exorcist, that is a great one. That one really holds up. There is one chilling thing here that foreshadows Arnie Johnson's problems. My grandfather says there's never been a person, past or present, who could disprove the existence of the supernatural. But given the same considerations any individual would have in a court of law, I could, if called upon for a proper reason, prove that ghosts exist, that apparitions exist, that haunted houses exist, that supernatural phenomena exists, and that the inhuman demonic spirit exists. Sadly, he tried to prove this after Arnie Johnson came under possession and murdered his, at the time, fiance's landlord. And it's chilling to me, because even at 14, 1 year later, I knew that this could not work in court, and my grandfather took the risk, and unfortunately somebody else paid that price. And we all make mistakes, don't get me wrong, but that one hurts, and it's important that we learn from those mistakes so that we don't ever repeat them again. One of the things that my grandparents raised as a true problem is how the occult is seen like a game, a diversion, a cure-all for what ails you. And if you're a negative person, you're going to attract negative things. You're going to get hurt. It is not something that you want to play with. And I know that obviously the people listening to this are, you're fascinated by the paranormal. But there are safe ways to do it, and education is the key. Finally, my grandfather says, the demonic comes in many forms, some far worse than what we've talked about tonight. Well, that's true. These things can manifest as anything, and they will usually manifest as your greatest fears. Something to keep in mind. Chapter 2 is coming up next.